Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. Let me start with the Global Connectivity Index report via Houmed. The GCI S-curve shows the digital economy journey of nations through the relationship between the GCI score and GDP. That's from Mohammed 2222022. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, given the recent interest, particularly in Ethiopia, which is at the bottom of the curve, but obviously has got a huge way to go. But it's a very interesting report about global connectivity and the new economy. Home Thoughts, actually one of my favorite books, which has been criticized by so many people, but I think unfairly, was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And the New Yorker has discovered an old article about this book. Conrad's little book has lost none of its power to amaze and appall. It remains in many places an essential part, a starting point for discussions of modernism, imperialism, the hypocrisies and glories of the West, and the ambiguities of civilization. Critics by the dozen have subjected it to symbolic, mythological, and psychoanalytic interpretation. T.S. Eliot used a line from it as an epigraph for the hollow men, and Hemingway and Faulkner were much impressed by it. Written in a little more than 2 months, the last of 1898 and the first of 1899, Heart of Darkness is both the story of a journey and a kind of morbid fairy tale. Marlowe, Conrad's narrator and familiar alter ego, a British merchant seaman of the 1890s, travels up the Congo in the service of a rapacious Belgian trading company, hoping to retrieve the company's brilliant representative, an ivory trader, Mr. Kurtz, who has mysteriously grown silent. The great Mr. Kurtz. In Africa, everyone gossips about him, envies him, and with rare exception, loathes him. The flower of European civilization, all Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. Exemplar of light and compassion, journalist, artist, humanist, Kurtz has gone way upriver, and at times well into the jungle, abandoning himself to certain practices. Rifle in hand, he has set himself up as God or devil in ascendancy over the Africans. Conrad is notoriously vague about what Kurtz actually does. But if you said kill some people, has sex with others, steals all the ivory, you would not, I believe, be far wrong. In Kurtz, the alleged benevolence of colonialism has flowered into criminality. Marlowe's voyage from Europe to Africa and then upriver to Kurtz's inner station is a revelation of the squalors and disasters of the colonial mission. It is also, in Marlowe's mind, a journey back to the beginning of creation, when nature reigned exuberant and unrestrained, and a trip figuratively down as well through the levels of the self to repressed and unlawful desires. At death's door, Marlowe and Kurtz find each other. It's the fascination of the abomination. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. Going up that river was like travelling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, heavy, sluggish. There was no joy in the brilliance of sunshine. The long stretches of the waterway ran on, deserted, into the gloom of overshadowed distances. On silvery sandbanks, hippos and alligators sunned themselves side by side. The broadening waters flowed through a mob of wooded islands. You lost your way on that river as you would in a desert, and butted all day long against shoals trying to find the challenge, till you thought yourself bewitched and cut off forever from everything you had known once, somewhere far away, in another existence perhaps. There were moments when one's past came back to one, as it will sometimes when you have not a moment to spare to yourself, but it came in the shape of an unrestful and noisy dream, remembered with wonder amongst the overwhelming realities of this strange world of plants and water and silence. And this stillness of life did not in the least resemble a peace. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. It really is a remarkable book, much criticized because it was actually writing about a period. He was of that period, Joseph Conrad, and therefore I think some of the criticism has been unfair. Anything approaching the change that came over his features I've never seen before and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched, I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw on that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. Conrad, we live as we dream alone. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling, but the darkness was here yesterday. Going up that river was like travelling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. It really is fantastic, and of course that takes me back to The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. Mr. Kurtz, he dead. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is, life is, for thine is the. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. This, however, is something different. Landing in paradise, Amanda Bay, Lamu, no rain here, photo by Alex I. Arledge via Kenya Pics, and Lamu is a wonderful destination if you've never been. Political reflections, you know, the horrific rape and murder of that young lady in India, which seems such a frequent occurrence. Colours of life, amazing photo got via Pinterest. Stop rape, it's crime, demeans humanity. Camless M. I've been following somebody called man_integrated. And he really is, I would say, a tour de force, if I might. And his latest thread, and he does it via a Twitter thread, is the axis of the world turns upon control of 4 resources: protein, water, energy, and firepower. The first is the subject of this thread. China's enormous population demands massive amounts of protein, and a war is on for it. And he takes us back to Christmas Eve 2013. Panicked calls to logistics managers working in the grain industry began flooding in. Without notice, China had banned the import of any corn or corn co-product that contained more than a tiny trace of Syngenta's MIR 162 transgenic trait. Trade name Viptera was in its first full year of mass market release, spanning many hybrids of corn. The trait is designed to kill insects that feed on corn plants, particularly various worms and corn borers. These insects can devastate a farmer's bottom line. The problem is Syngenta hadn't secured final regulatory approval in the largest foreign market for US corn products, China. The nation is an enormous consumer of corn protein sources for its domestic livestock and poultry industries, and had been the demand bull for years, but China was battling a domestic issue. The booming middle class was demanding more animal protein than ever. The government was desiring a move to greater food security, especially domestic production of critical feed ingredients. Corn production had to be incentivized. Unexpected record yields in 2013 tanked the domestic price, triggering price supports and massive government purchases of corn from Chinese farmers to keep them solvent. However, Chinese protein buyers preferred a different ingredient for their feed blends, DDGS, or distillers dried grains with solubles, are the main co-product of the traditional corn ethanol production process. With the Obama admin's expansion of the Renewable Fuel Standard, RFS, to blend 16.55 billion gallons of biofuels into the US fuel supply, ethanol was booming. DDGS, considered to be a more efficient feedstock for swine than corn-soybean meal rations, with most estimates being 1 MT of DDGS replacing roughly 1.22 MT of corn SPM. As the largest corn ethanol producer in the world, China depended on the US for this ingredient. After Harvest 2013, China found itself with a dilemma and an opportunity. Dilemma: oversupply of domestic corn with a better ingredient cheaply available from a frenemy nation. Opportunity: stage a conflict and lay the groundwork for better food security. It's important to understand a certain trade tactic employed by nations, especially China. Often the nation will soft approve some new tech without formally approving it. They will look the other way as it builds importance until it becomes a big enough trade weapon. A full-on ban would have triggered a WTO complaint by the US. A soft ban is harder to prove. This is what China did. They did not fully ban corn imports with any of the unapproved MIR 162 trait. They just made the threshold low enough that it was virtually impossible for any corn shipments to pass. The new import regime on corn went into place on Christmas Eve 2013. Nearly every American grain exporter was caught pants down. Many thousands of ocean containers, bulk vessels, trucks and rail cars were in transit to deliver DDGS to China. Everything ground to a halt. When the dust settled, multiple companies had gone bankrupt. Estimated economic damage to US farmers and companies totaled north of $5 billion, but no one was more impacted than Syngenta. It was devastating. Overnight, the once proud reputation of the powerhouse company was torched. Farmers fled from Syngenta crop chemicals. $1 billion+ class action suit was launched. Overnight, the once proud reputation was torched. Its value tumbling, Syngenta hit the skids. Sales for 2014 was strong due to farmers' habit of pre-purchasing most inputs the year prior. But in 2015, global revenues fell by almost $2 billion. The company was quietly looking for help. In 2013, the China Oil and Food Corporation was the largest buyer of DDGS. COFCO was the first entity to enforce the overnight ban on American corn product imports. Food prices are a leading indicator of potential civil unrest. The exploding demand for protein increased prices in China for years prior to 2013. Throughout 2014, the drumbeat of food security continued to resonate in China. Only 6 companies had the means to provide all of those at once. The big 6 of modern conventional agriculture are BASF, Bayer, Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and Syngenta. For China to get into the game, it had to buy one. That left Syngenta, who was suffering huge losses due to the COFCO enforced ban on American corn products. The Chinese-created crisis had weakened a key target. Dow and DuPont were already in bed, they were out. BASF didn't want to sell. Bayer had its eyes on Monsanto. That left Syngenta, who was suffering huge losses. For years, Chinese leaders had been hoping to accomplish 2 goals: improve domestic security, reduce American influence in the Chinese food supply chain. As of 1 week ago, the merger was moving forward. Frank Ning, the architect of Syngenta's pain and subsequent sale, will ultimately be the man in charge of China's burgeoning indigenous seed, chemical and research sector. And then he refers us to an article, Sinochem chairman says merger with ChemChina still underway. Also said the company is working on plans to list crop and seed company Syngenta on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. This thread is an example of how authoritarian regimes function internally. You learn little from the powerful men who speak from a podium. You watch for the domain-specific power brokers who make the real moves behind the veil of commerce and trade. People move assets. It is deadly business to underestimate an opponent that sees timelines in decades, not 3-year earning cycles. Only by looking backwards can we see the plan in action. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was a masterful plan, skillfully executed across multiple levels of impact. As I said in an article on the 15th of October, quoting a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, this geopolitical contest will likely escalate dangerously. Powerful forces on both sides are driving the world's 2 strongest countries toward full-fledged confrontation. 7th of October, on the occasion of China turning 70, I was quoting Don DeLillo, longing on a large scale makes history, which is the point that Man Integrated is making. Howard French, writing in World Politics Review, China's protectionism online is driving its own decoupling with the US. There has been much talk in recent months about a decoupling of the world's 2 largest economies, driven by the US under President Trump. But the stories of Alibaba, WeChat, and other Chinese tech companies show that Beijing has been pursuing a decoupling of its own, or at least a strategy of asymmetrical market access for decades now. I think that's a great terminology and phrasing of the problem. Consider China's Great Firewall. Earlier this year, the Spectator Index published a partial list of companies blocked on the Chinese internet. It included Google Search, Gmail, Yahoo, Facebook, YouTube, Wikipedia, Twitter, Netflix, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Dropbox, as well as the websites of the BBC, the New York Times, Nikkei, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and The Economist, amongst others. Indeed, many in China loathe it, particularly young people who often turn to virtual private networks or VPNs and other technical hoops to evade domestic internet controls so they can use Google and some of the other popular Western tech giants that are blocked. Life inside of a walled garden may be cushy at first, Houmed writes, but it is ultimately quite limiting, even if you get to cater to the world's largest population. Alibaba, WeChat, and other Chinese tech companies show that Beijing has been pursuing a decoupling of its own, or at least a strategy of asymmetrical market access for decades now. And Houmed is proposing a policy of virtuous reciprocity. A better approach would actively push for opportunities of positive-sum engagement about the shape of the internet and beyond even that, the future of the world economy more generally. Since the major players of the internet outside China, like Google and Facebook, are not allowed to operate in the country, Chinese companies like WeChat and TikTok should not be allowed to operate in the US or other Western markets until this asymmetry is seriously addressed. As recent news stories have troublingly demonstrated, this censorship extends to Chinese social media apps like WeChat and TikTok, which have been found censoring discussions outside of China, for example, about developments in Hong Kong, or the forced internment of more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And this is the important point. China corralling and indoctrinating its population online, insulating it almost entirely from varied sources of outside information, amounts to a strategy of weaponizing nationalism that threatens other countries. That is a huge, vital point. In the meantime, though there's only the walled garden where more Chinese citizens will become aware that their use of the internet at the center of so much of life today is crippled not by others but by their own government. Houmed was a fabulous guest this year at MindSpeak, and I've got the link there for the Q&A when I touched on some of these questions. As I quoted that in another article, if there is a decoupling between the two economies, so be it. The Chinese people can endure more pain than the spoiled and hubristic Americans. 12th of February, I was talking about Pyeongchang and the drama that unfolded. That was in 2018. And I said it marked a significant and iconic moment for the Mount Pektu bloodline. And for the second time in 2 months, Kim Jong-un has been riding a white horse on Mount Pektu. North Korea signals more confrontational stance with new horse ride, rare party meeting. Kim Jong-un mounted a white horse again as North Korea announced on Wednesday it will soon convene a rare meeting of the ruling party's leaders. Steps analysts say may signal preparations for a more confrontational stance with the international community. For the second time in 2 months, Kim visited North Korea's sacred Mount Pektu on horseback, this time accompanied by senior military officers and his wife, aimed at instilling a revolutionary spirit in the people, state news agency KCNA reported. Warned the United States that it has until the end of the year to offer more concessions to restart stalled denuclearization talks, or North Korea will pursue an unspecified new path. So getting pretty irate, it seems. The message is, buckle up, it's going to be a big year for us next year, he said, and not a year of diplomacy and summitry, but rather of national strength. 30th of April 2018, I was writing about what Kim had written in the book, A New History Starts Now, an age of peace from the starting point of history. I was talking about the Hollywood level optics of the Kim regime. The opening shot of Kim Jong-un surrounded by a phalanx of North Korean officials, later replayed as Chairman Kim sat in his presidential vehicle, surrounded by his ninja bodyguards, was almost as good as the opening sequence in P.T. Anderson's Boogie Nights. This was cinema of the highest level, which is no surprise when you consider that Kim Jong-il, the father, was obsessed with cinema and amassed arguably the world's largest personal film collection, over 20,000 bootlegged 35mm screening copies. Kim Jong-il also had a penchant for Hennessy parody cognac, and for 2 years in the mid-1990s, he was the world's largest buyer of Hennessy parody cognac, importing up to $800,000 of the stuff a year. Kim Jong-il began his career as the head of the state's propaganda and agitation department, and it's clear that Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, holds the same role and evidently handles all the optics as a chip off the old block. And then many years ago, in 2010, I was writing about far away in distant lands lies the hermit kingdom. They've all had tiny little hands like the elves and the shoemaker. NATO names China as new target alongside Russia. During this week's NATO meeting, they are going to officially add a new nation to the list of challenges in the form of China, with NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg saying NATO has to tackle the issue of China's growing capabilities. And that's what I was referencing over the weekend in my article, where I said if President Macron is diagnosing Europe's preeminent threat as militant Islam, then Fortress Europe is already lost to the geopolitical grandmaster Vladimir Putin and his bestie Xi Jinping. This was the first NATO meeting where leaders seemed to take the threat of a rising China as a direct challenge, but it was a muddled discussion, says the New York Times. Russia may be a disruptor on the edges of Europe. China is a builder. For the first time, it has a noticeable naval presence in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Nordic Sea routes. It is laying undersea fiber optic cable, meaning more NATO nations will be communicating over Chinese infrastructure, and those platforms will pave the way for artificial intelligence applications and quantum computing, two areas where China is investing heavily, often in partnership with European universities. But the immediate issue is driven by aggressive bids by Houmed to build 5G, switching systems in NATO countries from Italy to Germany to Britain. Earlier this year, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was warning European nations that if they buy from Houmed, the United States might terminate their access to intelligence. The reaction against Washington's ultimatum was so sharp that Mr. Pompeo toned it down. Now several European countries are arguing they can manage China's presence in their communication networks, a bid to avoid so angering Beijing that it retaliates by cutting European imports inside NATO. However, officials are struggling to understand what happens if its day-to-day communications run through Chinese switching systems and cell tower networks, a vulnerability China could exploit in a conflict. Poland's foreign minister Jakub Zapowicz even suggested that France is the Trojan horse of Russia. And I think he's got a point. There is little doubt that Syed Moqtada al-Sadr controls the streets in Iraq and can make peaceful protests violent when he chooses, says E.J. Malrai. Notwithstanding the presence of several smaller players and those genuinely asking for serious reforms, Moqtada can move the street in the direction he wants. However, the strategic objectives of Moqtada are unknown to all politicians in Iraq. I had a good friend who was a writer called Saeed Abarish, and he said the same thing many years ago about Moqtada. But the point is, he moves the street, and as Virilio said, the revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production, but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine, and itself becomes a motor, a machine of attack, in other words, a producer of speed. Protests are taking place across Algeria ahead of a presidential election that is scheduled to take place on December the 12th. As Kapuscinski said, and they've been protesting for 40 weeks or something, and even after Bouteflika, the wheelchair-bound, exited stage left, Kapuscinski, if the crowd disperses, goes home, does not reassemble, we say the revolution is over. It clearly isn't. Bloomberg editor quits over China story, has quit the organization in protest of the editor's handling of an investigative piece on China. I left Bloomberg because of the way the story was mishandled and because of how the company made misleading statements in the global press, and senior executives disparaged the team that worked so hard to execute an incredibly demanding story. Richardson, editor-at-large for Asia News. The story in question was written by reporter Michael Forsyth, who left Bloomberg for the New York Times after anonymous Bloomberg employees revealed that top editors did not publish Forsyth's investigative article on Chinese elites due to fears that Bloomberg would be expelled from the country. And here, what we do know is that Bloomberg terminals come first when it comes to China. And there, I think we have the problem with the candidate. He's beholden to his terminals. Rana Ayub on India's crackdown on Muslims is a short radio interview with her. That really tremendous article Dexter Filkins, Rana Ayub put together about Modi's India. Gangster. Let's go to the currency markets. Let's start with the euro, 110.85, dollar index 97.58, beginning to roll over, Japanese yen 108.90, Swiss franc 0.9875, the pound at a May high now, 131.41, and I'll come to that in a moment. The Australian dollar lagging, but I expect it to burst above 69. We're at 68.46. India rupee 71.605, so there were some expectations of a rate cut which were dashed today. South Korean won 11.90, 515. Brazilian real 420.77, so bit below the record low at 426. Egyptian pound 16.15. South African rand at 14.5922. That's behaved quite well. Dollar index, as I said, beginning to roll over a little. Euro dollar 110, where are we? 110.85. This chart is from FX Pip Titan. I think we're going to go a bit higher here. Sterling, highest level since May, 131.41. 18th of November, I said the pound has risen from multi-year lows like a phoenix, rising from the ashes, and has room to rally further, especially if Bojo builds a big lead. And I think Corbyn made himself untenable, particularly with the establishment. The establishment is not to be sneezed at. Comments about Chagos Islands, which is Diego Garcia, that was an untenable situation where he was proposing to hand it over. And it's such a key part of the Western projection of power globally. They couldn't afford that. Other comments about NATO. And I think, therefore, he has kind of knocked himself out. WTI crude oil had a huge session yesterday. We're currently at 58.30 and probably going higher now. Gold, 14.75. That's also bounced as well. Let's move on to sub-Saharan Africa. Emmanuel Macron conditions troop presence in Sahel on West African clarifications. France, the former colonial power, has the West's largest military presence, waging counter-insurgency operations in Mali and the wider Sahel, an arid region of West Africa just below the Sahara Desert. I want them, the leaders of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania, to clarify and formalize their demands regarding France and the international community. Do they want our presence, and do they need it? I want clear answers to these questions, he said at a news conference after a NATO summit in London. I can't have French troops on the ground in the Sahel where there is ambiguity by authorities towards anti-French movements and sometimes comments made by politicians and ministers, probably being stirred up by Vladimir and Prigozhin, for good measure. Given what we have lived through, I believe there is clarity, Macron said. France is not there, contrary to what's heard sometimes for neo-colonialist, imperialist or economic reasons. We're there for our collective security in the region. Macron said he had invited, and it was presented as if they were being summoned, the 5 Sahel leaders to come to Pau in southwestern France, where a regiment of last week's fallen soldiers is based, on December the 16th, to discuss the issue. Their response today is a necessary condition for our troops to stay. I wrote about this when I was, this weekend. I said President Macron's France experienced one of its worst losses in France's military in more than 3 decades, 13 dead soldiers during an anti-terrorism mission in Mali. 2 helicopters collided in the dead of the Malian night, moonless night. Salif Keita, one of Mali's best-loved musicians, released a video on his Facebook page in which he tells President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita to stop subjecting yourself to little Emmanuel Macron. He's just a kid, so we've got a highly volatile mixer. Island of Comoros raises $4 billion to fund infrastructure and tourism. Comoros raised almost $4 billion in financing, more than 3-fold the size of its economy, to develop strategic projects on the Indian Ocean island. Of course, they were the subject of that Intercept article we spoke about. There was a whole passport scandal going on there as well, but apparently there's a lot of oil and gas there as well. The financing was mobilized in investments, debt and donations at a meeting in Paris this week. The economy size is just $1.2 billion, 830,000 people. A meeting was attended by the hosting French government, representative of China, Japan and Egypt, Saudi and Kuwait funds. Comoros is one of the world's biggest producers of ylang-ylang, in essence used in perfumes, which together with cloves and vanilla accounted for about 90% of its exports in 2018, according to the Comorian Central Bank. On the Ethiopian highlands, church grounds have become accidental time capsules of biodiversity. New York Times. I grew up attending churches surrounded by parking lots populated by congregations that didn't connect their spirituality to ecology. So when I first heard about the church forests of Ethiopia, I was intrigued. I was in the office of a forest ecologist, Eshete, who started his interview by telling me a church, to be a church, must be enveloped by a forest. The church should be immersed in creation, enjoying and protecting the forest and shores and mountain, the whole earth, which ties up with those comments that were in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. E.O. Wilson, in his book Half Earth, declared the church forests of Ethiopia one of the best places in the biosphere. Secretary Pompeo announced the US and civilian-led transitional government of Sudan has decided to initiate the process to exchange ambassadors. We remain a steadfast partner of the Sudanese people in their pursuit of peace, security, prosperity, democracy and equality. 29th of July, I was talking about the Oud Spring in Khartoum. 10th of June, I said the zeitgeist of the revolution in Khartoum was intoxicating. As I watched events unfold, it felt like Sudan was a portal into a whole new normal. I quoted Hugh Masekela, I want to be there when the people start to turn it around. And I said Sudan is a Masekela pivot moment. President Ramaphosa was awarded with the Grand Croix de l'Ordre National du Mérite on behalf of the Grand Master. He sounds like some grand wizard. His Excellency President Alpha Condé of the Republic of Guinea. South African all shares up 4.33% year to date. Here come 10 outrageous predictions for 2020 from Saxo Bank. One of them is that the Rand is headed to 20 as the world cuts credit lines to South Africa. Currently at 14.57, near the top of the range, which is 14.50. State-owned South African Airways is entering a business rescue process to allow a radical restructuring under which the carrier will receive $274 million in funding. That's according to Pravin Gordhan. Foreign investors have ditched more than $9.6 billion of South African stocks and bonds this year, the biggest annual sell-off in at least a decade, data from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange has showed. So the question is there going to be an even bigger dump when they get downgraded to junk? Egyptian pound 16.1543, EGX30 up 4.6% year to date. Nigeria all share down 14.29% year to date. Ghana Stock Exchange down 14.19% year to date. Uganda plans to borrow 600 million euros to plug a budget gap, seeking lawmakers' approval for loans of 300 million euros each from Standard Bank Group's local unit and the Trade and Development Bank, according to a statement. Very interesting article in the Nat Geo, how the world's largest lion relocation was pulled off. There was once a peaceful hunting community called the Thozo living in the lush, wildlife-rich wetlands of central Mozambique. Beyond their village, great herds of buffalo thrived in the swamps. Elephants rumbled in the forests, and prides of lions hunted on the fringes of the floodplains. The village was led by a great chief, Galanguira, a hunter who loved the land because it provided for his family and community. One day, a large army from a neighboring tribe arrived. 12 warriors with spears came to Galanguira's house to kill him. While the rest of the army waited nearby, Galanguira fought like a warrior, defending his life and his village. He killed 10 of the men, but he didn't finish off the last 2. Instead, he dropped his spear and raised his arm, exposing his heart, and told them to kill him. With one thrust of an enemy's spear, Galanguira dropped to the floor. The 2 triumphant men were about to leave when suddenly a magnificent lion rose out of Galanguira's body and stood before them. Shocked and fearful, the men ran off to tell the rest of the army about the supernatural animal and the powers of the Thozo people. The army was never seen again. Galanguira's spirit lion still lives near here, protecting us, says Jorge Thozo, waving at the thick forest behind his house. He is the current chief of the Thozo community and the great-great-grandson of Chief Galanguira. Sitting on a wooden bench outside his small mud brick house, he tells the story of his grandfather with such pride and enthusiasm that one can feel the meaning of the words even before they are translated from his scattered Portuguese. Jorge can hardly remember the last time he saw a real lion. When he was a child, numerous prides of lions roamed the game-rich wetlands of the Zambezi Delta, but their numbers were decimated when their prey was overhunted during the drawn-out Mozambican civil wars, which raged from 1977 to 1992. In 2018, conservationist landowners, donors, and the Mozambican government came up with an ambitious plan to add some 2 million acres to African lions' range. They identified 24 healthy lions from reserves in South Africa and planned to relocate them to central Mozambique. And this is the Moqtada 11 concession in central Mozambique, where Mark Haldane, a South African hunter, is one of the architects of the lion reintroduction. He arrived there in 1995. The brick walls that line our runway were chipped with bullets, mortars, he says. Back then I didn't know how good it would get. He's now bringing in these 24 lions, and he's got a huge number of zebra, buffaloes, over 3,000 sable antelope, 25,000 buffalo. That's a lot of buffalo. All the animals have come back virtually to capacity, with the only exception being the apex predators, which he's now importing. And it's a really tremendous story. This is the village of Sosoni seen from above. This is the chief Jorge Tenento Thozo. There's a photograph of zebras running through the Zambezi Delta. A herd of buffalo thunders across the floodplain at sunrise. A lion that they brought back, and then 2 photographs of the Zambezi Delta. President Kenyatta is heard in this very short video from Don Zarigo. They should know there is nothing we do not know, which is interesting. Equity Bank's Dr. James Mwangi, the banker who has big plans for Africa. Basically in April, Equity Group, Kenya's largest lender by valuation, in a deal with Atlas Mara, giving it access to Mozambique and Zambia, allows it to expand in Tanzania and Rwanda. And then in exchange for 6.3% of equity, Atlas is exiting those 4 markets. Then they made a cash offer for a bank in the Congo. Mwangi says he's on course to be in 15 countries by 2026. The share price is worth about $1.92 billion market cap. Price earnings ratio is 9.7. The Nairobi All Shares up 13.01% year to date. The NSE 20 is down 7.08% year to date. Thank you for stopping by.